So we're very pleased to introduce Jennifer Wong, joining us from Beverly Hills, California. Jennifer is a historian, scholar, and a family historian, so I think what appealed to us in inviting her today as well was that specific sort of link. Not detached kind of academic perspective, but also giving us the familial, and that's exactly why she's here today. So Jennifer, please take it away. Welcome to Wolfsonian.
Hi everyone. My name is Jennifer Wong, and I just wanted to thank the Miami Design League of Preservation and the Wolfsonian for inviting me here. I'm really excited. It's my first time in Miami. It's pretty cool. I wish I had decided to stay longer because there's just so much to do. I'm going to have to come back. So I'm here to talk about my grandfather, my maternal grandfather. His name is Liu Jipiao. He is of Hakka descent, and generally his family came from Canton or Xingning, Ningzhou province. And he lived for almost 100 years, but 92, pretty good. And he lived in China, Europe, and America, and is known as the father of Chinese Art Deco. Now, everybody asks, my brother and I did grow up with him, and they lived about an hour away, but he never spoke about his time in China. My grandmother would say, oh, your grandfather's famous. He's a famous architect. He studied in Paris. But we didn't really know anything else about him, and we used to go, oh, that's nice, and then we went out and played. So he was just Gong Gong, which means mother's father in Chinese to us. And by the time we knew him, he was really quiet, stern, and honestly, as a kid, he was a little scary because he just was very inaccessible. My grandmother was the chatterbox, and she was the one that kind of bridged the gap. But what I do remember the most about my grandfather is that when he was painting, when he was creating or teaching, that was when he came alive. That was when he was happy, and he seemed content, like there was some like a burden was lifted from his shoulders. So a little bit about him. At the age of 5, he was named a child prodigy in art. And at the age of 8, he did his grandparents' portrait. Now his parents owned a silk dye factory which had over 500 workers and had government ties. And at that time in China in the 1900s, that was a pretty big deal. My grandfather was third brother of 7. He also informally studied at a porcelain design factory that was nearby. So they taught him how they made the porcelain, but how it was designed, and there's a certain process where you do the outline and then you fire it, and then you do something else and you fire it. And it was this whole entire process that he learned. Usually it was handed down from father to son or mentor to student, but he was such a prodigy and he was so excited about it that they kind of took him under his wing. And so as a teenager, he was sent to Shanghai to study art. And that was, we think, his first exposure to Western art. And even then, it was just a little bit because we believe that a lot of what he saw was just in black and white. He didn't get the whole full effect of the colors. And so that brings us around to the Republican period of China, which started around 1911, 1912. And there was a general push for students to study abroad. And this was facilitated by the Boxer Indemnity Fund Scholarship. About 47 Chinese went to America to study architecture and engineering. MIT, some went to Cornell, UPenn. And the person who was pushing this was Tsai Yuen-pei, who was the president of the Peking University. And he wanted people to go to France because he went to France, he studied in France. So my grandfather decided to go to France, and this choice would shape his art and his passion and who he was as a person for the rest of his life. And we think about that one decision that changes everything. You know, you think, oh, well, what would have happened? I just heard yesterday that the Paris Expo, which we'll talk about, was going to happen in 1914, and it happened in 1925 instead. And I'm thinking, my life could have been so much different if that had been done earlier. So my grandfather joined a lot of his friends in Paris, in Europe. Lin Fengmian was there, he's a famous Chinese artist. And he arrived in France in 1919. That's his student ID, when he was 19 years old. Yeah. So he lived for 6 months in Berlin with Lin Fengmian and Lin Wenzheng, which were his friends. And when I told my mom this, I discovered it in a magazine that was published in the 20s. She said, "Oh yeah, he climbed the Alps after he got his tonsils out." Or it was his appendix out. And then she walks away. And I'm like, wait. Like, what are you talking about? She goes, "Oh, I just remembered it." And so I would try to throw things at her, like when she wasn't expecting it, so I can get all this little information out of her to put in my notes. But he went to the Sorbonne to study French, because you had to be fluent in French to go to l'École des Beaux-Arts. So in May of 1922, he registered for l'École des Beaux-Arts as a painter under the tutelage of Ernest Laurent, who was a neo-impressionist painter and collaborated with Georges Seurat. But then in 1923, like every college person, he decided to change his major. And he changed it to architecture. And his friend wrote about him, and he said, quote, "He felt the powerful complexity of architecture could fulfill his inner needs, not as a profession divorced from art, but rather as a field of study related to fine art." And so this idea of architecture as fine art became a theme for him ongoingly. And he had a mentor, Emmanuel Petromoli, a French architect and archaeologist who worked at l'École. And so to give you a little bit of background of Chinese architecture at the time, architecture was a very modern concept for China. The way they built things was by traditional methods, certain designs passed down by master to master to master, and you just built the roofs a certain way, you used certain colors. There was no personal application to it. There was no creativity, modernity, artistic expression. They didn't see it as art. They saw it as a building that had a roof, had walls, it housed things, and that was its function. But moving on, he and his friends formed a group of modern artists. And they believed that China could be strengthened by the blending of Eastern and Western concepts. And they wrote, "The artistic spirit of old architecture has progressed and revolutionized. If you lose this spirit, you lose the ability to create new art that is of value. Contemporary creators must work together to find a new road. They must invent and discover, as in the West, thereby inventing a new art, style, and manner of doing things. Art and science are central to architecture, working together. The appearance of the natural world, the visualizations of the artist and the thought of the age are all important." And so that brings us to 1924, where they put together an exhibition that would be the precursor to the Paris Exposition of 1925. Well, this is the Strasbourg Exposition, and Oscar's got my other notes. Thank you. And my grandfather designed this poster, and this is a big, like 5x3 poster. And it's in, I saw it in the Lyon East Asian Library in France. But it happened in May of 1924, went through to July 31st, and it happened in Strasbourg, which is on the border of France and Germany, in the Palais de Reims. And he was one of 5 Chinese to organize the China section. So the Chinese portion of the exhibit is divided into 3 rooms, and it's lit with innumerable electric lights. Inside and outside the room, there are a number of beautiful just-made Chinese-style lanterns. And it took these rooms 1 month to prepare, and Liu Jipiao and his assistants are credited with the appearance. Now, remember, in the 1920s, electricity is kind of a new thing. So it was all very exciting and new. And this is one of the pieces that my grandfather had put in to exhibit. And you're starting to see some of the Western influence. So you do have the dragon, but you also have a peacock feather. And I was excited about this because in our family albums, we have this picture, and this is actually the picture, but it was published in another article, but the image was flipped. So I was like, oh, I knew this. So we have the image itself. I wish we had the actual pieces, but I'm still looking for those. So he displayed several pieces and was responsible for the installation. Here's another piece that he did. Again, we have the peacock, but we also have the Chinese ladies. So at the time, there were about 20 Chinese in Paris, and they formed two complementary but competing groups. So you had the Society of Chinese Decorative Arts, were the more traditionalists. They felt that they needed to teach the West about Chinese tradition, keep the traditions alive. And then we had Opus, which was my grandfather's group, Liu Jipiao, Lin Femian, and they drew on the Western style and felt that a hybrid of some sort moving into the new century, the new age, would be better. So Lin Femian argued that it was critical to identify common qualities between Chinese and Western art. Quote, "The shortcomings of Western art are exactly where the strength of Eastern art is, and vice versa. Complementing each other will make the world's new art." And so even here you see a little bit of the Nouveau, Art Nouveau influence, but it brings us to the Paris of 1925. Okay, I'm really excited because the 100th year anniversary is coming up. And now we're all going to Paris. So my grandfather's, the China section was in the Grand Palais. And my grandfather designed the installation. And this is his name here. It's his French iteration of his name. When I started looking for him online, I realized he had like 8 to 12 different ways to say his name, whether it was English, French, complex characters, simplified characters, and then he had his American name as well. So it's always interesting to try to find him online now. But for the Paris Expo, they were hoping to get funding from the Chinese government, like the other countries and other installations got a lot of funding. But China was in the middle of a civil war, so they really had no time, funds, or energy to put towards a small group of Chinese in Paris. So what they did was a bunch of Chinese export firms from Paris, London, and Shanghai donated, raised funds for them so that they could do this installation because they felt this was really important to be a part of it. But there was tension between those two Chinese groups, the traditionalists and the modernists. And so what do? Do you show all traditional Chinese art? Or do you show all the modern art? Well, they did both. They decided on a compromise, but because my grandfather designed it, it kind of ended up being more of a hybrid. And he designed also, he made a small catalog to go along with the China section. And so you can see kind of the same theme of dragon and peacock. And of course it's all in French, so I can't read it. But I had a friend translate it for me. Here we go. So it's a small booklet, this catalog, about this big. And a copy is at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles. And this was the first piece of work that my family discovered pre-America. We had no idea it existed. We didn't know he did any of this until we found it. And when we went to the Getty Research and it was translated for us, my mom just broke out into tears. Later she said the whole experience was very surreal. She said it was like meeting my father for the first time, but he was totally a different person. And I was very excited these postcards were made of the China section, because there's not a lot out there about it. So in 1927, he graduated. And his father asked him to come home. He's like, you've had your fun, you've learned all your stuff, time to bring it back and serve your country. Though we think he wanted to stay because there was a rumor he had a French girlfriend. When he got back to Shanghai, we found a postcard that was sent to him, and it was signed, "Hugs and Kisses, Simone." So, ooh la la, right? But he returned. His friend Lin Femian, who he had studied with and traveled with, was already back from Paris and had a new project for all his French classmates. Xian Pei, who was the one who wanted all his Chinese students to travel overseas, was still the head of the Peking University, and he wanted to remodel Chinese educational system after that of France's. So he asked Lin Fengmian to be the director of this new art school. And of course, Lin Fengmian turned around and hired all of his Paris classmates. So in 1928, in Hangzhou, became the first Hangzhou National School of Art became the first fine arts university and graduate school in China. And today it's still standing. It's known as the CAA, which is the Chinese Academy of Art. And this year marks the 95th anniversary of the school. Now, this group still believed that the Eastern-Western connection was really important, but how to get it out there. So they needed to expose people to that. So education was one way. Publication, these expos, exhibitions, and Liu Jipiao became the dean of the School for Design. And these other gentlemen and ladies became deans as well in their own fields. So my grandfather is on the far left, and Lin Fengmian is third from the right. And then Tsai Yuen-pei's daughter, Tsai Wei-lian, is the first woman in the first row on the left. And they even brought over a French professor, André Clodeau, and his family to teach over there as well. So I went to visit Hangzhou School 2005 during the World Congress, the Art Deco World Congress that was held in Shanghai at the time. So I took a separate trip to Hangzhou. And this is a huge photo that's in their major conference room. It takes up the entire wall, and it's of all the founders and students, I guess the first students. And my grandfather is on the far right now, up at the top. So I thought I'd go there and learn about my grandfather, but apparently I knew more about my grandfather than they did. But, okay, so during that time, this is a classroom setting. I guess it's a design class because he's in the back. He likes his scarf. He's also teaching, Dean of Design, and he starts publishing and creating magazine covers, contributing writing, and participating in several exhibits. So this is an ad for one of those exhibits. It was in May of 1929. It was the National Fine Arts exhibit, and it was put on by Lin Fengmian and the Hangzhou School students. And they invited Japanese artists, European artists to come. And there's a portrait of my grandfather that was painted by Tsai Wei-lian, Tsai Yuen-pei's daughter. But that's not all he was working on. Okay. Just like the Paris Expo, they wanted to do an exposition to bring in a lot of people. So they thought, let's do the Westlake Exposition. That happened in 1929. And it opened up a couple days after his birthday, actually. It ran for 137 days. You can see 14 million items and 20 million visitors. And he designed this logo for them. So if you ever go to Hangzhou, you can see this structure. It's like a sculpture that's in the lake itself. It's really nice. And there's actually a Westlake Exposition museum along the lake as well, which I'll tell you a little bit about too. So this was a rendering that he did of the front gate that I found in our photo album. And this is the picture of it. This is also said to be the front gate at night. So, and then during the day. Now, I thought there were two separate entrances. I thought, one was one side, and maybe the other was on the east side, and there was different entrances to the expo. But when I went, to the museum, I found out that it was the same gate. So you go in as a traditional Chinese, and then when you come out, you see the modern side of it. So you've been educated in a way, like you've been exposed to the more modern. So coming in and going out. Yeah, I was so excited when I learned that. I emailed my mom right away because she couldn't come with me to China. I'm like, I discovered something. It's really exciting. Also at the museum, there is a full-length scroll painting that shows all the pavilions of the expo. This is just a very small part of it. Just gonna flip through some pictures here. So these are all renderings that my grandfather did. And then the real life. This was a silk exposition building, silk pavilion. And this took him 6 months to put together. So you can see the tiers, and you start to see all the deco in there. And still, it has the flair of the Chinese roofs. Okay, I had to catch up on my notes here. Okay, so another way to reach the masses was publishing. And wouldn't you know it, one of his friends in Paris, his brother had a publishing company. So he did a lot of covers. So he designed this cover. This is for Gongxian magazine. And he liked to play around with the Chinese characters. So the first two characters say Gongxian. And it's a special edition that showcased his work. And the other Chinese characters are basically the date, the volume in the series. And that's one of his renderings of his vision of, I believe it's the library, a national library. So during that time in Nanjing, Chiang Kai-shek wanted to move the capital from Beijing to Nanjing. And so he came up with the capital plan, and he sent out words to everybody we're gonna have a contest. Send me all your renderings. Let's see what we can do. Excuse me. So, still Deco Chinese. My grandfather liked a lot of the columns, and he also played around a lot, you'll see, with tiles and mosaics, which is very European. This is another one of his renderings. Like on the cover, this is his vision of the National Library. And I was really impressed with the detail of it, even little tiny people over there. This is a shopping center. So you can see the tiers, you can see the waterfall design and the curves of the building itself. It still had the Chinese roofs. I found out my grandparents used to ballroom dance. So I love this picture because most of them aren't just dancing, like they're really dancing. Like there's movement in the picture, which I really like. And it must be in the family because my parents met dancing in Chinatown. My mom used to listen to American Bandstand because she lived in South Philly before it went national. And then my parents used to dance around the living room, so I've learned since I was 5. And then we taught my brother how to dance, and we were pro swing dancers for a while in Hawaii when we lived there. So I love the Cab Calloway's grandson is here playing every night. Y'all should come out. So he had China Traveler was another magazine. Here's some of the other covers. Again, playing around with the Chinese characters as bubbles. And automobile, locomotion, everything deco. Right? And again, you can see the Chinese characters in the front of the train. And chevrons and all that fun stuff. And somewhere, too, he met my grandmother. Aww. So they married in 1932. Were very active, social. They used to dance and entertain. They liked to travel. We need those coats today. It's really cold. And in 1932, he started his own architectural firm, and he had offices in Nanjing, Guangzhou, and Shanghai. And he imported one of the first European cars in China. And he put his name of the firm on the side of the car and would drive like important muckety-mucks around the city, advertising, dignitaries, government officials, all that kind of stuff. And he started working on the capital project in Nanjing and worked with the mayor of Nanjing to improve streets, waterways, villas for officers. And the mayor of Nanjing's son now lives in Pasadena. So I went to visit him a few years ago, but it was just funny because I'm only 20 minutes away from Pasadena. And in 1933, he became part of China's first generation of architects, officially. They started the Society of Chinese Architects. It was organized mostly by those who were educated in the US. And many worked on the Capitol project as well as Sun Yat-sen's memorial. And also at the time, he built several family homes, one in Nanjing, one in Guangzhou, and one in Shanghai. So this was in 1935 in Nanjing. And there was a main structure, low-rise wings, and guard rooms. There were 17 rooms on 2 and 3 stories. And it was more of a modern Western structure. My mom remembers a ballroom. She used to sneak out and watch them when she should have been sleeping. We all done it. When they left, it was taken over by a communist general. It was actually only 2 floors, but he put on a 3rd floor. And this is pictures from my mother's visit in 1985. And this is a shot of the interior. I was talking about the tile work that my grandfather liked to do. And this was a picture that I took in 2015. It's closed right now, I believe. It was taken over by the military. And then I saw a notification that said they hadn't paid their electric bills and it was closed. And I don't know what it's being used for now, and I've been trying to get in ever since. But it's kind of tough if it belongs to the Chinese government. So at some point he was pulled off his residential projects, but this is the Guangzhou house. He really liked Frank Lloyd Wright, by the way. Okay. So we're in the 1930s, and he was pulled off his residential and private projects to work for the government to help fortify forts for the Japanese were invading. So he was sent to Canton, Guangzhou. He worked on Human Fort. He was given the title of Lieutenant General Chief Architect to Chiang Kai-shek. Now we don't know where he went to in 1937 during the attack in Nanjing, but we think he might have gone inland to Chengdu University to teach there for a while. But we know he came back to Shanghai by 1942. Now, this is a garden-like residencies of 12 buildings or 12 units. And it was designed by his students who were also working for him at his architectural firm. And he bought 1 unit. It's since then been named a historical building, so we hope it won't get knocked down, but that doesn't mean it won't get knocked down by the Chinese, so fingers crossed. But it's in the French concession, and my mother was born there in the spring of 1943. So I was able to visit it when I went back in 2005. After my mom. And my mom, Gayuk, was born. And then in 1945, her younger sister, Galen, was born. Now, in 1947, things were getting a little dicey with the communists and the Japanese, and they were still trying to rebuild from all the attacks. Now, Zhou Enlai was a former classmate of my grandfather, and he asked if he wanted to join the Communist Party. And my grandfather declined. He said he was an artist. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a military. He didn't want to be involved if he could possibly help it, he wanted to stay neutral. He goes, I want the freedom to be an artist. But unfortunately, that meant he had to leave China for a bit. So, in 1947, he, my grandmother, and my mother were going to travel to America under the guise of being the Minister of Agriculture. And he was going to study agriculture in America. And they left my aunt at home with her grandparents because she was only like 1.5, 2. And they figured, well, for the 8 months to a year that we're going to travel, we really can't bring her. So what happened was they were at the airport on the plane to fly out of Shanghai. And a former communist student who he had helped in the past found them and said, communists are coming. They know you're on this plane. We need to get you off right away. Because my grandfather's name had been put on some sort of a blacklist and he had been targeted. And so they whisked them off the plane, brought them to the docks, and they got on a boat that was heading to San Francisco. And that took them 2 weeks to get there. And I was able to find the manifest, and their names are written in. So last minute. And it was in the middle of the night, too. It was like kind of crazy. My mother doesn't remember any of it, and my grandparents don't really talk about it that much. So eventually they landed in San Francisco, did the sightseeing thing, and eventually ended up in New York City. So I found some of these pictures in my grandparents' photo album. So I have pictures from Paris in the 1920s, New York City in the late 40s and early 50s. And I love these Art Deco buildings. I grew up in New Jersey, was born in New Jersey, lived in New York. But every time I see these pictures, I feel like I'm looking through the city with my grandfather's eyes. And it always gets me a little choked up. So they ended up in Germantown, which is Upper East Side. And a lot of people ask, well, why didn't they go to Chinatown? Some say that it's because of the European influences in Germantown. He did spend 6 months in Berlin. But we were the only Chinese family on the Upper East Side. I suspect that he was a little bit of an intellectual snob and didn't want to go into Chinatown with the peasants. So they moved in to the Upper East Side, and they eventually moved out, but I'll tell you about that, because they were paying $65 a month for like a 2-bedroom, and it went up to $80, and he thought that was just ridiculous. And I'm thinking, why didn't you save that for me? So we're in New York in the early 1950s. They don't speak English. He can't use his architectural license. What are they going to do to support themselves? In that time period, there weren't a lot of choices for Chinese. It was restaurants or laundry. So he started one of the first automated laundromats on the Upper East Side. He eventually owned 2. I recently went back to New York over the summer of last year because we never knew exactly where it was, and I finally found it just looking at the building, and we found another picture that showed the 3rd Avenue rail, and there used to be an above outdoor subway, and so I figured out where it was. It was on 82nd and 3rd, but I was very excited. I was showing the picture to everybody at the bar next door. It's now a 7-Eleven, by the way. It's still in a gorgeous building, though. So there were 5 other nationalist families living in New Jersey at this time while we were in New York. And they told my grandfather, you have to buy a chicken farm because we're making a lot of money. It's quiet out here in rural New Jersey. You know, come down, do that. So he sold both his laundromats and bought a chicken farm. I don't think my grandmother's that happy about it. My mother hated it. Can you imagine? She's like 10 or 11 years old about now. She's been riding the subways on her own and getting around and navigating New York. Now she's in Jackson, New Jersey, which is where Great Adventure is, if anybody knows New Jersey. There's nothing out there when they move there. Their closest neighbor is like 2 miles away. And so she's stuck on this farm all alone, working a farm. A lot of chickens. She didn't like them. Apparently chickens bite. They do. Now, we're at the summer of 1955. And we're finally reunited with my mom's younger sister, Gaylon, who has been in China this whole time with her grandparents. And my mom doesn't remember most of this, but apparently they were able to get my aunt out to Hong Kong. And then my mother had written a letter to a New Jersey senator, and they helped get her from Hong Kong to the United States. But there was an 8-year separation. So it wasn't a family reunion. It was like, I don't know you, but you're my sister. So that's Gaylon in the middle, and that's my mother, Gayuk. And she doesn't look happy, does she? No. It was awkward. No. She had to take care of a younger sister that she didn't know, and always being told, you should be grateful that you weren't left in China, kind of stuff. So it was tough. Oops. How do I go back? Going back. So 1958, the industrialization of agriculture. So all those little chicken farms went bankrupt, including my grandparents. They were forced to do odd jobs. We're close to Asbury Park, so they worked a lot of hotel jobs on the beach. But it wasn't until 10 years later, in the late 60s, that my grandfather was able to get back to what he loved to do. Architecture. This was his calling card. It was on a postcard, one of his renderings of a bank, and he sent it around as part of his resume. He eventually ended up working with an architect in New Jersey as his draftsman, but basically he was the architect for the company, but used their license to practice. And they worked on hotels and restaurants and local commercial buildings, things like that. And I was born in 1965, and my grandfather retired soon after. That's me. In 1967, he started painting again, and my portrait was one of the first ceramic paintings he did. Now, it's great. He had a garage in the basement of the house, and it had like 5 kilns in it. So he was still doing that process of painting and firing and painting and firing, painting and firing to do all of his work. And he also did watercolors as well as dabbled in the oils. My brother was born in 1969, so it's just the two of us. And so, like I said, we grew up with my grandparents, but they were retired by then. But it was a very prolific time for him art-wise. There was always something being painted at some point. And whenever we visited, it was like this game I'd play. I'd go around the house and look for new stuff. Like, okay, what is new? What's changed? What's different? So. This was painted in 1972. And I picked more of the modern borders and modern stuff, but a lot of his paintings went back to a more traditional Chinese subject. And we think it's because he missed China, and painting brought him back to a happier time in his life. And I also think he felt responsible for carrying on a tradition of Chinese painting that wasn't really around at that time. So he also taught classes, mostly private classes. He exhibited locally. He was in the North Museum Princeton, Corning glass. Design furniture. I want to make this couch. I need till somebody takes a picture. Good. This is an oil painting. It's a 5 by 5 foot, 5 foot by 5 foot oil painting that's in my living room. It's one of my favorite. It's painted on pressboard, like that really thin corrugated board, so whenever the weather changes, it warps on my wall. But he painted it, made the frame and everything. Again, he didn't have a lot of money at the time, so whatever he found, he painted on. So my grandfather died in 1992, and he predicted it. He goes, my father died when he was 92 years old. My grandfather died when he was 92. He missed it by like half a month, so I'm going to give it to him. And he left us his artwork, over 500 pieces of art. And we packed it up and put it in storage for 20 years. And my mom would routinely come up to me and say, you're going to do something with your grandfather's work. I'm like, yeah, okay. And I went on my way. Now, I am an East Asian Studies major. I went to Wesleyan University in Connecticut because they had a program where I could learn Chinese and do an exchange program where I can go back to China and meet family I had never met before. And that was really all I had in mind. And after I graduated, I did that, I went to China. But after I graduated, I didn't really want to do anything with that. I moved to New York and worked on other things. And about 10 years later, or 10 years ago, 10 or 13 years ago, a painting fell off my wall. And after that, it seemed like a series of fortunate events that happened like boom, 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 one after the other. So these are two of the paintings that I own that travel with me everywhere. Wherever I have lived, they are a pair and they come with me. And it's important to note here that when I started this journey, my mom had just recently returned from Singapore, diagnosed with cancer. And she had returned home to be treated in America. Whoa. And I think the research really helped her focus on something different, something other than her health. But back to the story, one of these paintings fell off my wall. And I have to explain how, like I said, he painted on anything he could get his hands on, newspaper, calendars, anything. So these paintings are watercolor, and he did the mounting, he even built the frames around it, but it's on that really thin pressboard, that corrugated pressboard. And what he would do is drill 2 holes in the back and take string. He would thread it, tie a knot, thread it, tie a knot, and then he put the painting on top of it and hang it up, which is great until after 30 to 40 years that string breaks. I'm like, okay, tie it, hang it up again. I just have to change the height, right? And this happens like 2 or 3 times. So I'm tying, and then eventually I can't tie it anymore. And there's no way to get to the back and do the whole tying the string and making it, hang it up again. And I can't put it on the top because then you'll see the string, and you can't drill into the back because the board wasn't thick enough and it would damage the painting. So I'm like, okay, well, I should frame them, put them under glass. I'm like, but maybe I should scan them first before I put them under glass forever. And then I'm looking into pricing and I'm like, well, maybe I should scan more of them because you get a bulk price. And I'm like, maybe I should scan all of them. So that's kind of how it went. And I was having coffee with some friends and they're like, why don't you write to USC or UCLA? Well, she went to USC. She goes, why don't you write to the East Asian Library and see if they want to archive your work, and they would help scan for you. And then maybe you could find a graduate student to help you research his history. I'm like, oh, sounds interesting. And so she wrote a letter of introduction. They wrote back. They came to our house to see the artwork. They brought the manifest that my grandparents came over on. I'm like, I had no idea. And they're like, they brought articles about him that they found online. And I'm like, online, I should look up my grandfather's name. And so that started the whole thing off. Online, I found an article written by an Oxford professor in the 1980s, basically about Chinese students in Paris in the 1920s. And my grandfather's name was in it, Lin Fengnian's name was in it, the Paris Expo was mentioned, and I was just like bouncing off the walls and yelling for my mom. And when I found it, we read it, and I wrote to the author. His name is Professor Craig Clunas from Oxford. And he was so lovely, he wrote me this whole long email back. And he hadn't been studying in that for 20 years, because he wrote the article 20 years ago. And he said, but talk to Nancy Steinhardt at UPenn. So I was like, okay. And so I did, and she calls me, and then she's like, talk to Dr. Jeff Cody at the Getty Research Institute, because he studied Chinese, spoke French, he did a book on architecture in the Beaux-Arts style. And so I did, and we got together with him, and he showed us the China section catalog that we had found, and he's the one who translated it for us. And then we got to know him. He's become a family friend. But a few weeks later, Jeff calls us up and goes, I've been asked to talk in Paris. There is an architectural exchange conference. We're supposed to talk about East-West connections. And I would like to do a presentation on your grandfather. How would you feel about coming to Paris and working with me on this? I know, exactly. She's like, what? I'm like, yes. So we worked on it, went to Paris in February of 2013. Now, this wasn't the exhibit, but what happened was we met a lot of people there and caught the attention of the Cité d'Architecture, which is the city of architecture and heritage. And they were doing an exhibit of Art Deco made in France. Yes. And it ran from October 2013 to February of 2014. And they asked us for some of my grandfather's work, because not only did they talk about how Art Nouveau started, then Art Deco and the Paris Expo, but at the end there were all these little rooms and grottos of Art Deco around the world. So they had Shanghai, they had Brazil, I think. They of course had New York and Miami in there. And so that's us on opening night. It's my brother, myself, and my mom. So she was well enough to come to Paris, which was nice. So actually, if any of you are going to Paris, I hear the museum is doing another Art Deco exhibit now, up until March 6, 2023, and it's called Art Deco France to North America. They've invited me, but I don't think I'm going to get out to Paris in time. So if you happen to be there, you should check it out. So our work at the Paris exhibit caught the attention of the World Congress, the Art Deco World Congress, that was holding their next Congress in Shanghai in 2015. So they called me up. So I got to go back to China after like 25 or 30 years, which was crazy, because it's very different than when it was in the mid 80s. And I got to meet a bunch of different Art Deco societies. They all came together during Congress. You'll see that, I guess, when they come here. And met a lot of wonderful people along the way. But I feel this journey that we've taken has been very important for my family, because we really want to get my grandfather's name back out there, share his legacy with everybody. And maybe more importantly, I was able to give my mother back her father. Now, my mom passed September of 21, but she had only known my grandfather as a man who had given everything up that he loved to survive. He was stern, he was quiet, sometimes even suicidal at times, to be honest. And learning about who he was as a young man, like with energy and dreams of art and beauty and all these wonderful plans, just gave her a totally new perspective on who he was, who she was, where she came from. And I am eternally grateful for the time I spent together with her working on our family history. You know, I would report all the discoveries and research that I've done, and I would put it on we have an online journal, and then she would write a blog telling everybody how she felt about it and what she learned. Like, she realized a lot of the things my grandfather did were very French. Like, even the way he wrote numbers and how he cooked. She thought he was lazy because he just threw everything into a pot and cooked it. She's like, no, that's what the French do all the time. So she just learned all these little idiosyncrasies that she just thought were grandfather or her father. But no, it was really his time in Europe and the time that he spent there. So I'd like to dedicate this lecture to her. And we have a new member to our clan. So I'm thrilled. My niece, who just turned 8, by the way, she knew my mother, knew my grandmother, and I am very glad that I'm around to teach her about her great-grandparents as well. And I guess the most recent discovery is that my grandfather's family found me like 3 weeks ago, a month ago, and apparently I have 500 relatives in Guangzhou who want to meet us because he, like I said, he was the third of 7. And so grandsons and wives and great-grandsons, and trying to figure that out in Chinese is just crazy. It's like it's your oldest brother's son's wife, you know? But there's a word. For every relationship, there's a word in Chinese for that. It's going to be crazy when I go visit. But they're all in Meizhou area. And they sent me pictures of, I don't have it, but of his ancestral home where he grew up. So when my grandfather fled China, like Craig Clunas pointed out, his name fell into obscurity. And he even wrote that. Nobody knows where they are. And when I read the article, I'm like, I know where they are. So, but I feel by going around and telling his story and exhibiting his work as much as possible, I reclaim a little more of his place in history, you know, alongside his colleagues as the founders of Chinese modernism. And, you know, since starting this work, there have been several Chinese students who have reached out. They've done dissertations on him. And what's great is they come and they visit, and I tell them about things. They get to see our family albums, but they also help me translate a lot of things. Letters. My grandmother wrote some stuff in Chinese on the photos, and I can't, it's harder to read. But I'm glad that they're reaching out to me now because we've had the journal online, and people are hearing about us. But I'm really grateful to everybody we've met along the way, including all of you guys. And I'd like to leave you with this, and I encourage all of you to tell your stories, okay? Tell your children, your grandchildren, sit down with your parents and your grandparents, your aunts and uncles, everybody. Because I really feel this gives us a sense of history, of belonging to something bigger than ourselves. And it tells us where we come from and who we are as families, but also as individuals. But most importantly, label your photographs. Again, I want to thank the Miami Preservation League and the Wolfsonian for allowing me to spend this time with you. And we do keep an online journal, so if you would like that, you can come on up afterwards. And an early Gong Hei Fa Choi, because Chinese New Year's is next weekend, January 22nd, Year of the Rabbit. Okay, so thank you very much.